Hey everyone, welcome back to Culture Binge. This is the Wisecrack podcast where today I interview two really exciting authors and thinkers. So we are breaking from our normal routine. Today we are joined by Will Stronge and Kyle Lewis, who are both involved at the Autonomy UK. Would we say it's a research center, institute, foundation, organization?
We'll go research organization.
Research organization, great. And I'm excited to talk to them today because they put out a book with Verso in September that's called Overtime, Why We Need a Shorter Working Week. I will say, I noticed this on the Verso website today. Currently, it's 40% off all books. So I'll remind everyone again at the end of the podcast, even if you're only like 40% sure you want to read this book, you can get a fat discount right now. So why not? It's the holidays. Read a book about why work is ruining your life. But I was excited to talk to them both because I like both of these individuals and they're smart and nice humans. And because we've been talking a lot about work on this podcast recently, both from cultural, political, economic, social, psychological perspectives, all that sort of stuff. So I was really excited to break this down. So to do like the formal intro, right, as I have it, Will, you are the director of research at Autonomy, and Kyle, you are the co-founder, and according to the website, you're the lead on shorter working week consultancy and research. Let me start with this because I'm going to make the wild assumption that the book comes out of the work you all do at Autonomy. So can you say a little bit about why you both were a part of starting Autonomy and what sort of the goal of the research and work you're doing is?
Yeah, so I think Autonomy kind of came out. So Will and myself, we were both working in academia. We both kind of had a philosophy background to begin with. But we became really kind of interested and fascinated by the subject of work. And there was a lot of kind of interesting things going on at the time. There's a lot of talk about kind of technology and, you know, it's kind of utopian or dystopian potential, and kind of interesting things politically going on in the UK at the time with the sort of the beginnings of the rise of Corbynism, etc. So yeah, we were really interested in the kind of future of work as a topic, and I think as well, you know, it was partly we were both kind of a little bit, I don't know if annoyed is the right word, but we were both a little bit kind of in precarious forms of work ourselves, and started to really kind of question and, you know, start thinking about work in a kind of critical way. So I definitely think, you know, we were both kind of precariously employed academics, or working at university at the time, having to do, you know, 2 or 3 other jobs just to kind of pay the rent. And so that's what kind of where our the beginnings of Autonomy started. Then it was mainly a case of then looking at the kind of think tank world at the time and realizing there was kind of a bit of a gap in the market in terms of people weren't really focusing on just one topic. A lot of the kind of big institutes in the UK look at our kind of whole range of issues across the economy. So we thought about doing something that was quite niche, to focus on work and to have a kind of, you know, a critical or maybe post-work angle to thinking about the future of work. So yeah, I think that's pretty much how Autonomy came into being.
Amazing. It's interesting to hear too. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Sorry, there you
go. No, I'm excited to have you on here, bud. You talk.
So I think there's something which we've always been interested in pursuing is not pursuing the kind of, I guess, the usual angle on the future of work, which is there's broadly two, and I think what Kyle's kind of alluding to about the normal think tank landscape or the kind of organizational landscape was that you often have a narrative about basically the best thing we can hope for in our future of work is just more jobs. Or alternatively, the best thing we can hope for is let's just let the market decide and see what happens. And so I think in between those two alternatives, we thought actually a perhaps more desirable, equal and sustainable future would be one where we think about the position of work in our lives and thinking about how it can be more sustainably pursued and so on. And I think when we talk about post-work angle, I think the main lens we're using here is taking an unromantic view on jobs. So like we do agree that jobs can provide sources of meaning and worth and so on. But I think we shouldn't assume every job does that, and we should really take it, take quite a kind of a keen eye to kind of examine the nature of employment in particular, but also other forms of work, but particularly employment, and say actually, well, is this bringing these supposed qualities, dignity, worth, moral value, and so on? And I think once you start doing that, then a lot of scales fall from people's eyes, and I think a lot of our analysis kind of actually sobers up. And I think that's what we're trying to pursue in a way, is try and kind of take a really realist look at the nature of work today, and then try and push for more ambitious policies going forward, basically.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you talk about that realism because, to pivot to the book in particular, I think something that I really enjoyed about the book, once again, Overtime, Why We Need a Shorter Working Week, is the realism of the scale. Because like you said, what one can read about, books that posit a post-work future that sounds utopian and delightful, but reading it from a practical perspective, it's hard to see, the 3 steps that get us there, or it's hard to imagine that in our lifetime, or other things that are a bit more dull about, increasing jobs in a country by 5% in a quarter. But I think that idea of, and I think it's very clear at the end of the book as well, this call for, Friday not being a working day. It seems it seems both reasonable and attainable. And I think that one could come to your book not maybe sharing your overall political perspective or analysis and get to the point where it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do. So what led to this being the book that you chose to write at this point? And why did you focus it around this? And I mean this in a positive way, this simple and straightforward idea of our working week should be shorter, and here's why. Like, what led to that?
Well, I think originally we kind of looked. There were a few books kind of coming out or focusing on working time, but they were mainly kind of being written from a business perspective, let's say. So thinking about why it'd be good for productivity, why this is good for retaining and recruiting staff. But what we felt was kind of missing was, making the case for a shorter working week from the perspective of workers and from the perspective of kind of a tradition of the labour movement and kind of social movements that always kind of thought about the freedom of work, like the potential of having more time for ourselves and what that meant for collective freedom, for human flourishing. So I think that was a kind of maybe the basis kind of for wanting to write this particular book on working time.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I think I basically agree with that. I think that's where we're trying to go with this, and I think there are other books as well which look at, for example, policies. And I think this is what's slightly different about this book from our work at Autonomy, is that we're not here in the book just kind of laying out a kind of bullet point list of here's how you go about it, which is really important, and we do that, in our day jobs. But I think for this book, we wanted to make the case as kind of the argument on the basis of freedom, equality, and so on. Anyone who's basically backs progressive causes, here's why the shorter working week should be something which should be part of any future of work that we're talking about. Because it wasn't really that specifically in a book. It's kind of here and there in various books that we really respect. But we wanted to have something in kind of quite concise form that you can kind of say, this is the reason why. There's a whole set of arguments in here.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. And it is such an interesting time for this because I think, 2 things that have been happening, I'm sure, in both of our countries in the past couple of years. One has been this massive shift towards work from home and a lot of positions that weren't traditionally remote are becoming remote. And there's been that shift where at first it seemed like people were not excited about a global pandemic, but excited about working from home. But in my amateurish research and on the level of you two, I know that working hours in the States at least have gone up for a lot of people who are working from home. So this guise of, the freedom that comes from not having to go to the office leads to more working time, leads to the blurring of boundaries between when we are working and when we are not. I know just from a very personal level, it's something that I fall into, and it sucks. And I think if that is like the side of where people have realized how domineering work can be over their lives in the past year or so. The other thing I found really interesting was at the earlier part of the pandemic in the States, when they gave us money for a little bit, there was a period, at least, out here in Los Angeles, a big chunk of people, whether they make a lot of money acting or a little bit of money working as an assistant on a set, so many people work in entertainment or adjacent to that, and everything just shut down, like the entire industry for a while. And at that period, we actually had like a solid unemployment program, got some government checks. And it was very interesting to hear people realize how good they felt not working. And also at the same time, have the experience of both not having to work and having guaranteed income. And it was this little like accidental bubble experiment with like a 3-month period of people not having to work and not having to worry about money. And just the amount of anecdotal conversation you could see online, or when you would catch up with people about how happy they felt not having to do that. So it seems like, at least over here, these discussions have gone from being, I guess, a little bit more theoretical or pie in the sky to a bit more practical, because it's like people have tasted that freedom. They've had that experience now of knowing what it's like to work less and what it's like to worry about money less. And I guess what I'm asking is like, and I don't know exactly what the last couple of years have been like for y'all, but I mean, do you think that we're in a moment where people are starting to see this future, the one that you all outline, as maybe more attainable than they might have thought a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point you make, and we touch on this in the book, and we kind of say, especially when it comes to implementing schemes of kind of work time reduction, when we look over. When we look historically to periods of crisis, often shorter working week or reduction in hours has been implemented in order to basically avert a particular economic crisis. The interesting aspect of it is, though, that states often, as soon as that crisis is averted, tend to come down straight away and to go back to a normal way of working. And those kind of regulations that were brought in are soon receded. And that's when the kind of conflict happens, because workers who have experienced, working a shorter working week or having kind of government support in a certain way, suddenly don't want to go back to the kind of new normal, the way they used to work before. So I do think it creates a moment, a possibility, a kind of window in which change can happen. But, I think that's all it is. And we have to realize that it is just an opportunity. And if we are going to have more kind of autonomy in our lives, in our working lives, then, it's going to be fought for, at multiple levels, in the workplace, politically, in order to really, to get those freedoms, on a permanent basis.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No. Once again, Will, it's all you.
But I'm going to wait next time until I'm asked to speak. I feel like I just jump in all the time.
No, you should jump in. You should be the one who jumps in, I promise.
Sorry, I feel awful. I think I basically agree with all of that. I think we have seen a shift, though, and I think a shift which may or may not be acted upon. And obviously, right now we're going through what's now being called the Great Resignation. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something which in the UK, we know it's not just because of Brexit. We know it's not just because of, it's not because of any other reason than when we've done some surveys with workers and so on, is that a huge dissatisfaction with working conditions. And suddenly, what's prompted this? We've had bad working conditions for a long time. I think something like the COVID pandemic, which puts huge strain on workers, actually shows that not only does it put strain on them, but they realize that the working conditions before simply weren't sufficient. And this big shake-up, you suddenly have this recognition that I don't want to do that job anymore. That job was awful. I've only got so much of my life to live. And so I think that's really interesting. And I don't think that will necessarily go away, even if it doesn't mean that it will translate into necessarily a kind of like amazing utopia of work. I think as Carl says, it's an opportunity. I think just to corroborate what you're saying, Michael, I guess my little snippet of the LA kind of 3-month bubble was I was in the park when we all could like walk around in the first summer and kind of be outside and it was all nice and so on. I met my friend who's a kind of audio producer for an independent media organization here in the UK. And he's from Spain, and I saw him like lying under a tree with his hat over his head. And I was like, "Hey, Oriel, what's going on?" And I was like, "How's life been? I haven't seen you since before the pandemic." And he was like, "I'm having the best time of my life." He's like, "I'm getting paid. I'm getting paid a furlough scheme, and also independent for self-employed support. And basically, it's like getting warm, and I'm just like, this is it." He's like, and he literally said, "This is the post-work dream. This is it. We're like just relaxing and getting paid." And I think, although that's not the same for all workers in the pandemic at all the key workers and so on who basically didn't get pay rises, were struggling and so on, at the same time, there was a whole strata of workers who did, as you say, feel this new lifestyle. You walk around the parks, there's people just sunbathing and reading on a Wednesday. And suddenly, like, I think that's not to be sniffed at. And I think that is something like that kind of shift is something which, won't, even though there was anxiety about the pandemic, I think it does do a cultural, it's significant.
Yeah. And so it really felt like that feeling where you go on vacation or holiday or whatever, and you come back and there's that post-holiday depression sometimes where for a week or two, you just felt like what it was like to live a life based on what you felt like doing and relaxing. And then that first day back from work, it's like, oh, this is hell and I hate everything about my life. Why did I ever leave? Because now I know what is on the other side of that. And it felt, like that on a larger scale.
Yeah, I do. I think that's the thing. I mean, I think David Frame, the sociologist, he talks about mini utopias being something which breaks us from our normal way of working. So he talks about, for example, you go on holiday for a bit, or maybe you take a break from work and you've got a really good redundancy package or something like that. And those mini utopias can really shift us from what we consider to be a kind of normal or natural way of doing things.
Mm. Yeah. So kind of related to this, I wonder as well, because something I've noticed, and I think it applies to what you're talking about, this comes up in the book as well, is kind of this shift in people's self-identification in terms of being laborers or workers. And I do think in the past year or so, we've seen a lot more people who maybe 2 years ago wouldn't have identified as like working class or a part of labor shift that. I know that in the world I exist in, I've seen a lot more like digital media labor organizing, people that are a part of that sort of like, vaguely online creative class starting to organize, identify as workers. And I found it interesting that in one of the books that a lot of people have read in the past year, the newer Sally Rooney novel, there's even a character in that book who's like out with friends at the pub who has an argument about what it means to be working class. And someone says to the character like, "Oh, you work for a literary journal. Surely you're not working class." And this character who makes almost no money explains to them the difference between being paid wages for your labor or existing off of like surplus capital that creates more money for you. And it does feel as well like there's been a little bit of that shift, which has seemed kind of positive. I mean, how much do you think that your project and vision, what you argue for in the book, depends on more people kind of identifying as a part of labor or as a part of the working class?
Do you want to go, Will?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think actually it is a really interesting problem. It's a good question as well, because it really highlights basically, I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. And I think basically the question of working time kind of both needs an understanding on people's part of their relationship to work, but it also increases their understanding of their relationship to work as well. So if you consider yourself, and again, you're right, it's a massive problem in the way that people consider themselves, what class they're part of and so on. And I think often the discussion can hide more than it really reveals, but nonetheless, you consider yourself to be someone who basically has to rent themselves out for money in order to survive, then the time of renting yourself out is incredibly important, right? You recognize where those boundaries between freedom, literally, and also the time when you are under the disciplinary control of one shade or another of your boss. And so I think it absolutely what used to be called class consciousness is incredibly important for putting forward the kind of recognition that work time isn't free time necessarily. In fact, it necessarily isn't. And therefore, we should limit it. And that's basically the cause of freedom. But at the same time, and this is partly what, we're hoping to do with the book, and also with, many other authors and campaigns and so on, is that we're also trying to, by pushing the issue of working time, putting that question on people, what would you do at a 4-day week, or how about a 4-day week, how would it work, and so on. You actually raise consciousness of self, because people think, actually, wow, I never heard that idea before. Oh, wait a second, yeah, it's true. Why do we work 5 days a week? And why that seems kind of arbitrary. So I think it's a bit of a, not quite chicken and egg. I mean, talking about mutually beneficial or kind of basically, you kind of, if you have one, you can have the other, and equally, if you have the other, you have the first, and so on. So that's my initial thought on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, man.
No, you.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think part of that kind of that class consciousness or raising is, again, it's come about in those kind of middle class professions as well. As I was saying in the intro, Will and myself, and we were both working as academics, which seems to have a lot of kind of cultural capital to it. But then when people ask you what you do, you can say I'm a lecturer, whatever, I do this work. People are, oh wow, but there's a kind of presumption that, oh, you must be earning loads of money, and it must be this, it's great life. When in reality, precarious working conditions and poor working conditions are now flooding across, what was traditionally quite middle class professions, where people probably for a long time didn't really see themselves as working class. But I think with that happening, people start to realize, hey, my wages are shit. I'm not getting a pension here. I'm working all the hours under the sun. And I think that has brought to the fore and making people realize that actually, we are workers. And yeah, I think that's definitely been a part of it, kind of breakdown in working conditions across the board, really.
Yeah, it was interesting. A few weeks ago, when I was kind of first prepping to talk to you guys and reading the book, there was an interview in Vox with this author, Anne Helen Peterson, pretty popular culture writer. And I mean this in a positive way, by no means is like a radical political theorist, but she said in this interview, I have the quote here. She says, I'll just say the greatest trick that offices ever pulled was convincing office workers that they're not workers, that they aren't labor, and instead that they're doing what they love or following a vocation, a calling, and thus that exploitation is not something to be worried about or to fight back against or to be understood as unacceptable. And I found that interesting because I do think that language, especially of what people do for work as like a love, a vocation, a calling. And I know that all of us have had that shared experience of being in academia where you get exploited because you're almost convinced that you're following some like intellectual, spiritual purpose. And I think a lot of people in creative fields have the same thing where it's almost like it's not your job, it's your calling. So it has been interesting, I think, to see people reframe those things. And I think with someone like this author, it's been crazy to see in kind of the more mainstream discourse, people just talking about this. And, like I said before, not a lot of stuff to be super optimistic about these days, but at least having that kind of reframing and dominant ideology feels at least kind of good.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about that comes up in the book is, and I thought this was great, the way you all talk about the catch-22 of time freed up by technology. And I do think, and you point this out as well, that we live in this era where more and more technology can do things to free up our time. So whether that's, automating our bills or chores or groceries or parts of our work, but how, capital or the market or, the big corporations, whatever you want to say, then find new ways to suck up that time. And in reading the book, I couldn't help but imagine some kind of like idiocracy type future where, even if we're not working a lot, then all of the rest of our time is spent consuming things created by companies owned by Jeff Bezos and all that. And it also made me think, so along with this podcast, we make YouTube videos, and we have a recent video essay that's on hustle culture. And we got a big response to it because in the video, it's kind of looking at the way in which this notion of hustling and grinding and always doing things can sort of kind of infect people's brains such that that's a good way to live. And I think that's the point of reading your book where I felt the most grim, just thinking about this tendency to either be consuming or hustling at all times. And I don't know, I don't know if I have a question there, but I wonder if y'all have thoughts on that, or ways that you've seen that to kind of fight against the kind of twin poles of either always be consuming or always be hustling.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll just jump in quickly, Carl. Sorry. I think it's basically the Wall-E. One of them is the Wall-E future, right?
Yeah.
One of them is basically the kind of the kind of mass. I think the reason why I have a problem with some of these like imagined futures, i.e. like the hustle future or the Wall-E future, is they seem to be basically just the reason why they don't quite chime with me is that I feel like they're basically just reverberations of the kind of basically our current socioeconomic situation. So basically, if you had more time, that would probably be for more hustling. Or if you had more time, it would just be filled with consumption. And I wonder if basically it's almost a part of the problem that these are the images we have of what we do. I tend to think that if you had more time without a loss of income, that fine, there'd be some more consumption and so on. But I think a lot of consumption comes about because you're deeply unhappy, or you basically effectively you haven't got time to do X, Y, and Z, so therefore you find a fix, which might be ordering a delivery, or you you can't bother to look for presents, so you just quickly go on the Amazon app and you quickly just buy whatever, and so on. So that's an example. So I wonder if sometimes these images are kind of basically the kind of the marketing industry's image of what people do in their time, which is to constantly consume, and they would do it just to the nth degree if they had the capacity. And I wonder, equally with the hustle culture thing, I mean, hustle culture is kind of grim mainly because I think people just can't get enough income from their main job, and so putting yourself through. I know some people get a kick out of it, and obviously the entrepreneurial self is definitely an ideology that's spread. I don't think it will go away just like that, but I do think often the kind of side hustle is there basically because your main job, and as Carl said, across the board labor conditions are just so crap that you basically have to find some other way of getting income. So I wonder if you move to better working conditions, reduce working time, would people still think, God, I got this itch, I need to do some side hustling? Or is that for the majority of them be like, actually, I'm kind of okay, I don't need to kind of be a kind of self-branded marketeer on the side? That's my thought. I don't know about you.
So we need the image of your friend in the park who's just hanging out enjoying himself as the picture of
I think basically, I think I wonder if it's not that much sexy an image basically, but I think this is part of the point, is that actually there's a lot of general kind of just mundane enjoyment that people will crack on with when they have, say, Friday off. They're like, I'll just see friends or go to the pub and so on.
No, I mean, and it resonates with me in terms of when I feel particularly overworked. Like my go-to is always, I end up watching way too much kind of just not in a sport. I drink way more than I usually do, and I eat crap food. Yeah. I just want to be this kind of this. I just want to consume, and I do think when you have that kind of free time, you do feel relaxed. Like, I don't want to watch TV. I want to listen to music. I want to read books. So I definitely think there is a link there between that overwork and also just like you say, wanting to be a kind of finding kind of solace or relief in just consuming.
Yeah, I mean, it is that cycle sometimes. If you get that to the end of a work week, and no matter what your weekend plans are, you feel so shitty that then it becomes like, I'm going to, like you said, eat too much, drink too much, get stoned, lie on the couch, watch stuff I shouldn't, get to the end of the weekend, wish that I would have gone on a nice walk, eaten a better meal, spent some time reading, done something productive or creative. And the next thing you know, it's Sunday night and it starts all over again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And when it's so Will and I, like in our day job, we do work with firms that are, implementing a shorter working week, that have moved to, they're trying to implement a 4-day week, and we kind of go in and we help them implement it, and we analyze the trials. But when we do interviews with staff, that's the thing that they kind of find, is that Friday really becomes really personal to them. It might be that they end up doing, like, either getting all the kind of life admin out of the way, or on that Friday, so that they actually have a proper weekend, or they just have like a really kind of just lounge around or whatever, and then have a really productive Saturday, Sunday. But it's amazing how that kind of day, they just end up filling it full of stuff that they kind of need to do, so that they can actually have a proper weekend, and having that kind of, or for other people, it became a time in which they got on and did, like extra educational things, or they were thinking about setting up a business, and they kind of used that time for that, So it's amazing when you give people kind of extra time, how they actually use it. And it's usually for, like Will was saying, not stuff that we imagine we would do, i.e. just kind of lounge around and do nothing. It's productive, but in a kind of non-productive way, if you see what I mean.
Well, then this is a good transition then into, I want to hear more about this then. Like because this is great. You guys aren't just writing books about ideas. The work you do with Autonomy, like you said, you're working with actual firms and companies actually making this stuff happen. I wonder if you could describe a little bit more what that process is like. Because I know in my head, sometimes I think like, maybe I should approach the, head of our parent company. If you're listening, head of Enthusiast Gaming based in Toronto, let's talk. Or hire Autonomy to work with you. I hope I don't get fired for saying that, but don't cut it. I think if I were to call the CEO of the company I work for and say we should have a 4-day work week, you'd probably say, well, sure, but that just means we're going to have to get all of the work done in those 4 days, and everyone's going to have to work 10 hours instead of 8 hours, or whatever it might be. So what is that process like when you are working with a company who presumably has the goal of, using labor hours to create a product or profit? How do you go about convincing both people at the top and workers themselves that this 4-day work week thing is going to not ruin their business?
Yeah, so usually it kind of starts off, a managing director will get in contact from a company and say, we're thinking about doing this and we want some help. It might be help in terms of they need to convince a skeptical board of doing this, so they want us to kind of come in and produce data and to show how it's possible and how this won't detrimentally harm their business. Or it's for us to basically come in and to come in and analyze it, and just to kind of troubleshoot along the way when they're going through the trial process, just to kind of have some expertise kind of working out any potential problems that they have. But I mean, we kind of have our red line in terms of how we see the trial being implemented. So, we'll only do it if it is, based on no reduction in pay for workers, and it's not based on any kind of ideas of then, cutting staff or anything like that. It is to implement a 4-day week, which we usually count as between kind of 28 and 32 hours. And yeah, it's basically help them do it. Every company has different reasons for wanting to do it. Some are more kind of focused on the kind of productivity aspect of it and wanting to recruit and retain staff. So there might be companies that can't basically offer the kind of wages of the leading kind of companies within their sector. So they think, how can we attract staff? How can we give them a better work-life balance? It tends to be from the kind of recruitment and retention angle. But others, some companies just feel it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. They want their workforce to be well rested. They actually really value their staff, and they want to be kind of innovators within their sector. So that tends to be kind of the initial process, and then we'll go in, we'll We'll do workshops and interviews with staff at the beginning of the process. We'll work closely with management, looking at their kind of strategy and the way they're implementing it, and just give feedback to make sure they're kind of doing it in line with what we know will be successful. And then, it's just kind of managing the process and analyzing it at the end.
I think basically, I think there's what we found really fascinating about the process with working with firms at the shop floor level is that the way we perhaps usually frame it, and the way you framed it there, Michael, in terms of like companies are pursuing profit and so on, how's that square with workers having less time and so on? Actually, it is slightly more complicated, particularly in sectors where, and particularly with companies which have as part of their remit to basically create a good working culture. So it's kind of, it's not quite, you might go into this thinking, basically there's this big homogenous blob called capital and employers who basically want to work their workers to the bone. On the other side, there's workers who basically want free time. And I think the broad contours of this, dynamic within capitalism may be true, but when you start talking to companies who say, actually, we want to make sure that we need people to come work with us because we treat workers well because we want to keep them with us, and it costs a lot to retrain employees, and we can't keep having people burning out and going sick. That's bad also for the bottom line. You start adding all these factors, you start realizing actually, in some cases, it actually makes total sense to give decent working conditions, and in a great many cases, you realize. And that's not to say that we think that we can go into any company and reduce working weeks, and that any company is coming to us. That's not true. As Carl's saying, a lot of them are like good employers already, and we think that shouldn't be really sniffed at. We're not getting calls from Amazon fulfillment centers being like, "Hey guys, can you come and help reduce the working week? No loss in pay." Yeah. That's not happening. What we're talking about is we're kind of, when decent employers or employers who run a pretty nice setup, like for example, wherever they have good holiday and good working conditions and so on, they come to us and say, we want to run these trials. We're like, sure, that's great. That's a really good initiative, and we'll show you how to do it so it benefits the employees, but also perhaps doesn't affect your bottom line. And that's another thing that's important to add, is that there are many companies which can much more easily do this than other sectors. So you're thinking about things like normally desk-based work. Often they can be creative industries. They can also just be general administrative kind of workplaces. In contrast to healthcare, social care, teaching, and so on, where actually you will need to increase staff numbers in order to kind of spread that work out. So that's just all to say that there are always going to be first movers in particularly good employers when this kind of change, where this change comes from. And we saw today, recently, Atom Bank in the UK, so a bank are doing it. So that's all really good. But that doesn't mean it's the whole labour market, and that every employer is somehow got its best, employees' best interests in heart. I think it's important to say these employers are good because they do this. This massive bunch of employers are not great because they're basically adhering to the same kind of bare logics of capitalism, which I think is particularly where you see the harm being done.
Wow. And something you both said, which if anyone's listening to this who's a CEO of a smaller company that wants to attract great employees, just from a marketing perspective and employee retention, who wouldn't want to apply for a job at a company in your field that was just leading with, we have a 4-day work week? And I think even if it paid a slightly less or something like that, I know if I was looking for jobs and saw that, it would probably make me think, okay, these people probably aren't purely evil. So why wouldn't I want to do this? So I think, even from a very practical perspective, it seems worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think, but just to be totally clear, that's part of what we do at Autonomy as part of consultancy service. I think we shouldn't, from my perspective, I don't think we should be talking about the shorter working week purely in terms of how to make it work in businesses in the here and now. I think we should talk about, I think, important to note that, and that's what we're trying to do in the book, is really say the shorter working week has been a demand of workers for at least 200 years, or slightly less than 200 years in terms of in the American 19th century, when they talk about kind of the abolition of slavery. The debates around working time were already happening then, and so I think that's the angle I think is most important and progressive to push. And I think having these nice case studies and of companies already doing it is powerful But I sometimes worry that it can be reduced to just the business case, and I want to make sure that we're talking about it in a more, like, let's say, emancipatory and sometimes philosophical, but nonetheless kind of a direction of travel.
That's great. And let me ask you this too: where you all would know this? Did I hear that recently? Is it Iceland or someplace that did like a large scale 4-day work week experiment?
Yeah.
How did that go? I don't know, because I did know, I was recently listening to a podcast episode. What podcast was it? I think it was Science Versus. Never mind. I don't want to give anyone else free podcast promotion. Cut that. I was listening to a podcast from a larger competing media company, and but they were discussing this, but it was all from the perspective of like talking to CEOs that were like, basically avoiding the stuff that you were talking about, the important stuff as being the important stuff. But what have there been any case studies recently on kind of like a larger scale, whether it's Iceland or wherever? And if so, what have you all gleaned from that?
I mean, shall I just jump in quickly, Carl? Just on the Iceland stuff?
Yeah, you go for it.
Just I edited the report we put out on the Iceland trial. So the Iceland,
amazing.
The Iceland experiment was hugely significant, and it got, it was like suddenly, global news, and one of our researchers, Jack, was speaking on, Canada radio in the morning, and then there's also
because there is just one Canadian radio station.
Yeah,
I think it was actually called.
There's a hand cranked antenna there for it because it's Canada.
And then Australian, and then like I was speaking in Joburg, of a Joburg radio station, and yeah, so it's huge. What I find interesting about what you just said, Michael, is that we find this all the time, that discussions around the 4-day week, they basically start either on issues or problems or talking to CEOs and so on. There's almost, as you say, no discussion about why this is actually really good and what happened, because it's almost taken for granted that obviously this is exactly what we would all want to happen. It becomes a question of pragmatics and also a question of like, there must be a problem with it. So I think that's already telling that, a lot of the pushback that you get from this idea is people say, yeah, but how would it work? It's like, wow, well, you admit then that you want it. You admit that we all want it. Yeah, of course we want it. Okay, good. Well, then let's figure out how to do it. So I think that's an important point, that we should be like, if we all admit that we think that we should do this, let's give it a shot. Anyway, the examples you're looking at, basically what happened in Iceland was that there was 2,000 employees across the public sector, which is 2,500. It's about 1% of the whole workforce. It's a small country. Basically, for 5 years, ran reductions in working hours of different levels. So between 1 and 5 hours knocked off the week. So not a load, but nonetheless, that brought down working weeks to around 35 hours per week, which I know in America would be crazy, and in other parts of Europe, pretty normal.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it was. People, the kind of analysis of the results of this for everyday lives was huge. People managed to see their families more. They took up different hobbies. They went to walk outside in the amazing Icelandic kind of natural habitat. And so I think this even just like a few hours off was made a huge difference to a lot of people. And they obviously would never want that to be kind of returned to normal. So the trade unions basically, after this trial, sedimented this in contracts. So 86% of the workforce, not just the public sector, but including the private sector, they had new contracts negotiated. So they either had reduced hours or new mechanisms to negotiate reduced hours with employers. And so that's huge. It's a small country, but now the whole working landscape in Iceland has been shifted by this trial, by the positive results that came of it. And I think that's why it got such huge news. Not only because everyone loves Iceland, who doesn't love a hot spring?
Oh, we all love it.
But also because suddenly the story was that actually, unbeknownst to everyone, for 5 years, workers in that country negotiating with employers via trade unions basically organised a trial. It was successful, and just subtly did it basically. So it's amazing.
It was crazy as well when we put out that report. Within like a day or two, the BBC picked up on their website, and so like Iceland moved to a 4-day working week and had a picture of like a hot spring, like people and then suddenly it was just like every day we're just getting media requests from all around the world. Like Ocasio-Cortez was like it was on her Instagram. What's the actress from Frozen?
Kristen Bell.
Kristen Bell. She had it on her Instagram and stuff like that.
Wow.
It was mental. So yeah, we got a hell of a lot of publicity from that.
Suddenly everyone had to remember who's Kristen Bell, but it was incredible either way.
That's amazing. And I think with all of that too, it just does make me think that a lot of the work that you all are doing, and I think the cultural shift we're talking about, is a great fight against what I think is one of the most harmful ideologies of our generation, and I'm sure younger generations, which is this like do what you love mindset. I know there was a book that came out, was it 5 or 6 years ago? I might say her surname wrong, by Mia Tokumitsu, that was called something like Do What You Love. There might have been a Verso book as well. You might be publishing buddies. But I think it almost came out too early. And I know there was a version of the essay that led to the book in The Atlantic, and another one was published in Jacobin. But it was basically just breaking down that whole idea of associating your work with love, vocation, this thing. It's just been this really toxic ideology. And I think that, you know, a lot of the things that you're talking about have led to that shift where people recognize that if you are just in a hot spring outside of Reykjavik, that's also good. And it's not lazy, and it's not a lack of value. Or if you're in the park reading a book, or if you're learning how to knit, or if you are, you know, writing a novel that no one might ever read just because you find it intellectually and creatively engaging, that's like good. And I know it's something you talked about in the book as well. I know we'll wrap up in a second, but you know, there was a part where you guys kind of criticize a certain type of socialist humanism for treating work and labor itself as a virtue, which I think is also really important, because I think even in sometimes more vaguely progressive ideologies, work is still seen as this inherently good thing, or this part of being human. So I think that everything you're doing to disassociate our minds from work as necessarily being a part of what it means to be a good human is important. So, and the last thing I'll praise you for before we wrap up this is great job as well on tying the shorter work week stuff to environmental change. I think it's the penultimate chapter of the book where you get into that. So just have to say, great job on that as well. Well, yeah, a couple of things before we wrap up then. So for anyone listening to this, we are going to have a quick chat with Kyle and Will that will be up on the Patreon. We're gonna do after this. You're not going to hear it right now, everyone, but you can go over there and hear it, where we're going to talk about a thing briefly that we get a lot of emails about and people always want to talk about, which is academia. Because spoiler alert, the reason I know these two is from academia. We were all at the same university for a bit. So we'll chat about that. So hit the Patreon if you want to hear ex-academics just shit all over the university system and name names. No, but before we wrap up, we often do a thing at the top of the podcast where we have a little segment where we talk about things we're loving and things we're hating in culture. We'll keep it positive, so only do love. But what are some things that y'all are, when you're not doing your important work that could change the fabric of labor on the planet, what are you watching, reading, listening to, things like that these days that you are enjoying? No pressure to make them sound too impressive or anything, but just curious, what sort of culture is inspiring your journey?
So yeah, the two things I'm watching at the moment, I'm really enjoying. The first was actually recommended to me by Will, and I ignored him for a long time and said I'm not going to watch that. But is a series. I don't know if it's available in the States, but it's called Baron Noir. It's a French kind of political drama about a strategist from the Socialist Party in France, basically trying to unite the left. It's partly like he's trying to unite the left, but also it's about his kind of own political ambitions as well. And yeah, it's just really good. It's great to have a kind of political drama that's really kind of steeped in left politics. It's just really well acted. It's great. I'm really enjoying that. So I'm on the third season of that. And then the other one, which I think everyone's probably watching at the moment, is Succession. So I've just finished the first season, and yeah, I'm really digging it. Just the writing's really sharp. Like I'm pretty sure it's the writer from Peep Show.
It is, yeah, Jesse Armstrong.
Yeah, and I do kind of that kind of peep show humor does come through quite a lot, and but yeah, just in general, the script writing's really great, and yeah, so they're the kind of two things I'm watching at the moment.
Amazing, yeah. One of the best things about Jesse Armstrong writing Succession is it's led a lot of people in the States who have never heard of Peep Show to work backwards now. So it's been very fun in the past like year or two to have American friends. Not to be pretentious, but I used to live in the UK, so I got to watch Peep Show when I was very young. It was a big blessing in my life. It really killed the remaining hope in my soul. But it's been great to watch Peep Show have like a second life over here now. Will, how about you when you're not doing world-leading research on the place of labor in the modern world? What do you let your brain relax to?
I just turn off and go into a cupboard for a bit, and then I come out and do research again.
Wow, thank God.
No, no, I'm currently finishing. It's taken a while, but I'm glad for it. I'm finishing the new Kim Stanley Robinson book.
Oh yeah.
The Ministry for the Future, which is like the first bit of fiction I've read for a while, which I'm very much enjoying. And yeah, listen to a lot of music. I'm really enjoying the new Dave, or the latest Dave album. Just put together my best of the year lists and stuff. So yeah, just kind of basically a lot of music, and then a lot of sci-fi, and then back to the research.
Amazing. I'm glad you brought up music because, for everyone out there, I think of Will as someone that likes music, that knows a lot about music, that has good taste in music. I think I still listen to things that years ago Will had recommended. So good to hear that. Yeah. So while you all cannot ask these men questions live right now, there's a couple of things you can do. One is that if you are interested in this conversation, have thoughts, feel free to email us at culturebinge@wisecrack.co. That's culturebinge@wisecrack.co. And also, if it's for them, I'll at least forward the email. Maybe I can look at it. You can also call us at 213-534-8807, 213-534-8807. Before we end this, where can people both find you all on the internet and your work? So where should people check you out? Kyle, how about
so I mean, if anyone wants to check out our research, you can find through our website. It's autonomy.work. And so my Twitter handle is autonomous_coys, if anyone wants to follow me there.
Will, where can people find you on Twitter?
At W_Strong, with an E on the end of Strong. And I was hoping Carl's going to do this, but you can get our book at Verso Books, verso.com.
Yes, 40% off right now, at least on the American site. So if you're listening to this, why not? Why not do that? And then
in the bargain bucket.
Yeah, no, it's all the books are 40% off. It's not just yours. And Will did mention his best of the year music list, so we'll expect him to post that on Twitter. So thanks again for listening to this, everyone. Thanks for sticking around, guys. Once again, Will Strong, Kyle Lewis, Autonomy. The book we talked about is Overtime, Why We Need a Shorter Working Week. And if you want to hear all of us gossip for 15 minutes about academia, head over to the Patreon and you can check that out. So we'll catch you next time on Culture Binge.